reoccurrence of any future cash flow crisis. Please come on and help me to welcome to the floor Ms. Tanya Jonas.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for introducing me. I hope that this particular innovative platform that we are going to discuss, that we have implemented as a city within the Nelson Mandela Bay Municipality, will be both informative and assisting yourselves as well as your peers in also resolving maybe similar challenges that you had or are currently facing with regards to the problem statement. If we can just continue. So I will be doing a presentation on how we addressed or how we utilized a threat into opportunities for innovative thinking. And as the previous introductory speaker indicated, we are facing challenges across various institutions, specifically within our government spheres. And when we face these challenges, we often find ourselves in a bit of a panic. And that is best when we become innovators and we start, formulating a kind of a think tank to address the threat that is at hand. So similarly, that was basically where we found ourselves as an institution within Nelson Mandela Bay in 2010. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. Okay, so just to put it into a little bit of a phrase, the words Houston, we have a problem, that basically, rang true for us as an institution when we realized that our working capital was not sufficient to address our total commitments in terms of our creditors and not just our suppliers, but also for future payments with regards to different types of creditors like our employees, etc. And because of that challenge, we needed to come up with a methodology or with control measures that needed to address the cash flow crisis. So with that, we had to construct a method to vigilantly monitor on a day-to-day basis the working capital that was available to the city so that we could still maintain our daily operations and service delivery. With that being said, we also wanted to prevent the implementation of punitive measures by our creditors. Our suppliers were becoming a bit jittery, and as well as the punitive measures that are within the ambit or the responsibility from the National Treasury. We also needed to look ahead, and part of the innovation that we came up with was to ensure that what had happened in that particular period did not reoccur. And that is where our data sets and our information that we had on hand played a real role and the interpretation thereof. So we needed to find a way to utilize that data in a manner that would not only service our internal stakeholders, but also our external stakeholders. And we can move to the next slide, please. So as one of our great predecessors of time, Albert Einstein mentioned, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. And that is exactly what we learned at that point in time, that yes, we were in a difficult situation, but there's also the opportunity to obviously find solutions to the problem and to mitigate the risk of the problem reoccurring. Thank you. The next slide, please. So one of the opportunities that came our way out of that particular threat was the online supplier payment scheduler. So we had all the payment data in our database, payments to our external suppliers or our external creditors, that is. And with that information, we realized that that could assist us to closely monitor the day-to-day commitments, plus the commitments that are probably due a month, 2 months, quarterly, 6 monthly, annually, that we could then utilize to implement a supplier payment scheduling tool. Now, this scheduling tool enabled our cash management section to assess all invoices payable that were approved and that were assessed and verified, and then to schedule those accordingly. Obviously, taking into account all our various internal controls, our payment business processes, as well as our payment value chain role players. And that would then assist to calculate the NMBM's daily working capital value. So that would be utilized to gauge how much revenue or cash on hand or working capital do we have versus the expenditure in terms of invoices payable that needed to be paid on each and every day. And that information was then utilized and recorded on a cash flow monitor payment scheduling tool. We call it our EFT cash flow monitor, which was then made accessible to all the internal role players within the supplier payments value chain. Just to add to that, we have a decentralized payments value chain where our directorates or sections, or if you want to call them line departments, they basically verify each and every invoice that is applicable to their section. So it's decentralized in the data capturing of the invoices. So that being said, each delivery or each invoice that is payable will go to the originating section or the originating department. That will then be assessed, or the work done or the goods delivered will be assessed and verified, and thereafter the department head will approve the payment. From there, once it's approved, the information is then accessible by by our cash management section, and they are able then to calculate the daily working capital. And at that point in time, what was key was to be able to indicate to our internal and external stakeholders that yes, we are in a cash flow crisis, but the daily working capital value available to us is X. Therefore, we will be able to pay a value of Y, if you want to call it, for that particular day. So that assisted in giving the assurance to our internal and external stakeholders that in as much as we do have a cash flow crisis, all is not lost. And that therefore, facilitated your information sharing internally as well as externally, as well as our transparent decision-making processes. Next slide, please. And then, as we know, in as much as we have internal stakeholders, it takes two to tango. So within a business relationship, we have two or more parties. It's not a unilateral relationship at the end of the day. So we had to bring together another tool, or put together or find another tool that can satisfy the needs of our internal stakeholders as well as our external stakeholders. Next slide, please. So our next opportunity out of this was to develop our online self-help supplier query tool, which, as you can see from the land or the login page, is a web-based tool, and it is housed on our formal nelsonmandelabay.gov.za internet page. And this particular tool was then to facilitate the information required and the decision making required by our external stakeholders. Next slide, please. So, because we are a debtor, we are a large institution within our area, within our geographical area and beyond, and we are a debtor. We obviously faced reputational damage during our cash flow crisis because of the payment uncertainty. We had our debtors wondering if and when they were to be paid the value that they had delivered to us in terms of works, or in terms of goods delivered, or in terms of services. So we desperately needed a facility that could appease the questions that were being posed by our debtors, to say, fine, in as much as we have this problem, we can now schedule our payments so that our cash management section, once they've scheduled it, the external stakeholders can utilize the self-help supplier tool, and they can then log on and check and assess if indeed their invoice has been scheduled for payment and by when. So this then assisted or reduced, in fact, the number of queries that we were being faced with each and every day because of the number of creditors that we deal with. We needed to then appease them and inform them that they are being paid, how much they are going to be paid, and by when they will be paid. Next slide, please. So this self-help web-based tool enables the supplier to perform an invoice number search. This is the invoice that they would submit to us. They would have it within their IT systems or on their supplier statement. And without having to phone or email or come visit our offices, they can then perform an online search themselves to see if the invoice has been processed and if it's been scheduled for payment as well. They could then view the payment date or the scheduled payment date, and they could then also view the payment remittance prior to the payment being effected as well as afterwards. So they could then download that information. And because it's available 24/7 and throughout the year, it then also allows them to do their debtor reconciliation business function on the go. So they weren't now constrained to just doing their reconciliation or performing an invoice number search during office hours. And what we have found by utilizing our activity monitor, which is built onto or linked onto this supplier query portal, is that indeed there are suppliers who very often who utilize this service after hours. So it does assist them to do what is their core business, I would say, during the day or during business hours, and then after hours to do the office work or paperwork. And that's specifically helpful for our small and medium sized suppliers because they are often more or less a one-man, two-man show. So it has definitely served its purpose with that regard. Next slide, please. So the spin-off or the perks for that is that it reduces telephonic and emailed queries. We find that only those suppliers who have a query relating to the invoice not displaying or perhaps they had submitted an invoice that is linked to a query, they will basically contact our offices. Once they've got access to this tool, very often they very seldom contact our offices for a query. It also allows us to publish must-read messages. We've used it to facilitate messaging to our suppliers based on requests. So, for example, we do publish must-read messages regarding their submission of monthly statements to our accounts payable section so that we can also conclude as an institution the reconciliation of their supplier statement. And then we also utilize it for our annual messaging in terms of our financial year end information, just to prompt them that or inform them actually that there is a financial year end that we are closing in or approaching, and we would like them just to submit all invoices on time so that we can conclude that particular financial year end processes also within our calendar due dates. Next slide, please. And then the question would probably be posed as to where are we moving towards from here? So we do have the internal scheduler that assists our internal stakeholders, the scheduling of payments. Then we also have what we've described now as our supplier query tool. And the next step would be to enhance our supplier query tool. If you, oh, sorry for the next slide, please. Um, to have that enhanced and to work as a two-way communication in the need for online submission of invoices. I've mentioned earlier that we do have small and medium suppliers, just as we have more developed or bigger suppliers or creditors on our vendor database. With that being said, we also want to allow the online submission of or uploading of invoices to minimize queries that are identified after the fact. So built into that particular online submission facility that we would like to enhance our portal with is validations. So we have various validations already built into our accounts payable systems, and we would like to have that mimicked or placed within the portal as well, so that when a supplier submits a portal, they get an invoice via the portal. They receive a validation message, either an acceptance or a rejection message with reasons, obviously, and that will definitely assist with post-receipt non-compliant invoices. It will also give the suppliers again the assurance that once their invoices have been successfully uploaded, they then don't have to either email or phone or visit our offices to verify if it's been accepted, if it's been received, if it's been successfully submitted for further approvals, etc. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, that was our presentation from the Nelson Mandela Bay Municipality. And once again, I thank you for the opportunity for describing our innovations. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Tanya, for sharing these very amazing insights. And it's always good to learn from each other's cities and to see how we can learn and adapt. And you mentioned very important points that one might not necessarily see their link to a city's resilience. So managing supplier payments is a critical one. And as mentioned, it has to do with managing relationships and trust between the city and its key stakeholders. And so you also mentioned a point around managing reputational damage during a cash flow crisis, and, you know, using access to information, putting in place self-help portals to reduce the number of queries and complaints from creditors. And so transparency is one of the key ways of navigating a cash flow crisis. And that's a very important lesson for all cities, I'm sure, and for all practitioners here. As I mentioned, we are in the middle of a cash crunch and a constrained economic growth climate. And so that impact is felt at the city level, and, you know, the Treasury coming knocking during such a situation is something that you want to avoid at all costs. And so thank you, Tanya, for providing us with a practical case and an instance and an experience that we can all relate with, and start to generate ideas about how we can adapt these practices for our various contexts. And so thank you very much for that. Next, we have an input from another very critical party, actor, and contributor to the urban agenda and to shaping the cities of the future. We talk about all of society approaches and knowledge partners, and the academic space is a critical component of that. So one of our previous speakers today talks quite strongly about the power of ideas, data, and good storytelling to drive social change. And that data we get from that data isn't always about, you know, number crunching, but that the human element is central. Allow me to introduce Professor Rob Kitchin from the Maynooth University of Social Sciences Institute and Department of Geography. His research examines the production of digital geographies, and his present ERC-funded project is called Data Stories, telling stories about and with planning and property data. He is formerly a principal investigator for the All Ireland Research Observatory, the Digital Repository of Ireland, the Building City Dashboards Project, and the Programmable City Project. So quite an illustrious portfolio of involvement and activities there. He is also the co-author and co-editor of 34 academic books and over 200 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and he has been an editor of Dialogues in Human Geography, Progress in Human Geography, and Social and Cultural Geography. He is a recipient of the Royal Irish Academy's Gold Medal for the Social Sciences. Today, Professor Kitchin takes us through the Data Stories project, which he is undertaking an extensive data audit of the entire housing and planning data ecosystem in the city of Dublin, across state, business, and NGOs. Again, quite a big undertaking. And his input today will focus on mapping data generation and data flows within the planning ecosystem and at the local and national scales as a means of identifying potential sources of system intelligence and open data. I will now hand over to Prof. Kitchin and welcome him to the floor. Please flight your presentation, Prof, and take us through. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Hopefully, can you see my slides okay? I'm assuming you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to talk. So I'm going to quickly start by giving you a background of the kind of work that we've been doing, which hopefully might have some applicability to the kinds of things that you're interested in yourself. So I guess I've got 20, 25 years now of kind of playing around with data about cities and with city organizations. So a part of that led to the kind of forming of the All Ireland Research Observatory in 2005, which is really undertaking a lot of kind of empirical, practical work with local authorities and with regional government and state government departments, both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland, trying to create a set of data tools, but also going in and helping try and fix various kinds of data issues within those municipalities. Some work on the Digital Repository of Ireland. So this is a trusted digital repository aimed at the GLAM section. So that's national galleries, national libraries, national archives, national museums. RTE is the national broadcaster. And it's all kinds of kind of qualitative, unstructured kinds of data. So images, sound, music, film, video, and so on, and providing a kind of a repository of those data, so born digital data, so it's available in 100 years time and so on. More recently, working on building city dashboards. So this is administrative data, but it's also real-time data. So it's data coming off of various sensors relating to transport mainly and environment. And creating, again, a set of data tools that allow people to visualize and interact with that data, make sense of it, make decisions based on it, and so on. And also pushing it into 3D. So we've been building these kind of 3D models, both kind of a 3D virtual model, which you see in the bottom right of the screen, where the buildings are coded with their building use and so on, and a 3D printed model, which I'll show you a bit later on, where we project the data onto a 3D model itself, a printed model, a physical model. And then more recently, we've been working on the Data Stories project, which is about trying to understand the data ecosystem for one sector for an entire city. And obviously planning and property data is really important in terms of government policy legislation, in terms of informing media discourse, public perception, informing corporate investment strategy, so guiding billions of euros worth of investment, and also in relation to NGO and advocacy work and things like data activism and so on. But often we don't really pay much attention to the data themselves. In a critical kind of sense, we tend to just take them and use them, accept them at face value. And what we're interested in is the kind of the data politics and the data power around what is collected, how it's collected, who it's shared with, how it's transformed, how it's used, the various kinds of issues around data governance and regulation, and the management of that data how the data is interpreted and shifted into policy, and so on. And obviously that ecosystem is quite wide. It consists of planning data, data related to stock, data related to land, to housing, households and population demographics, to finance, so things like loans, mortgages, taxes, and so on, into housing management, into construction activity, into employment and materials. So do we have the workers for that can help build more housing and so on? Do we have the right pipeline of apprenticeships and so on? What's the market activity? Specialist kind of housing, so kind of homelessness, refugee accommodation, student residences, nursing homes, and so on, and kind of housing actors. And so what we've been interested in the first phase of our project, this data storage project, is mapping that whole ecosystem where we're looking at how all of these organizations sit together, how the data sits within some of these organizations down to the level of individual variables. So we're mapping all the individual variables, whether the data is open or whether it's closed. And obviously partly what we're interested in is what data is locked inside these institutions that might become open. So we know that very little of this data actually ends up as open data, and a lot of it is locked inside of institutions. And we can get a sense of how diverse this ecosystem is just by considering its actors. So we've been mapping out who is generating and using this data and sharing it amongst each other and so on. So this is just the slide for the state. And you can see there's a whole range of different actors related to policy, to delivery, to regulation, to finance, to analysis, and so on. And we've been asking each of these organizations to basically tell us what data they have. The same across business. So the ecosystem is not just state data. Companies produce data about property and planning as well. So whether that's real estate companies, real estate platforms, property analytics companies, the banking finance sector, surveying, inspection kinds of work, or it's NGOs, so service providers, advocates, so homeless charities, kind of cooperative housing bodies and so on, whether it's community advocacy, whether it's things like an NGO like the Irish Council for Social Housing, or whether it's professional bodies representing people working in the sector. And we also know there's some international links. So we know the Irish data doesn't just sit inside of Ireland, it flows out. It flows out into European bodies, it flows out into global corporations, and so on. And some of that data flows back as well. So data from Eurostat, for example, helps inform what's going on in the Irish system. And then we've been trying to, so an example of maybe trying to zoom in and have a look at one system. So this is an attempt to kind of look at what's going on in planning. So within planning, typically we've got strategic development, control and enforcement. So kind of pre-development, the development pipelines, so people applying to build something, and then post-development, inspecting whether what was planned was actually built and whether it meets control standards and so on. And trying to look at the data within these systems. So in the strategic, a lot of the data is actually coming from elsewhere. It's coming from the Central Statistics Office, it's coming from the Environment Protection Agency and transport agencies and so on, and is informing things like county development plans, so future plans about places and so on. I'm going to show you development control and our attempt to map out the data flow. And I appreciate this diagram is complicated, but but in a way that's its point. It illustrates the fact that this is a very complicated system. So the middle bit, if you like, is if you're applying to build a house in Ireland, this is kind of what happens with the data. So you apply through a website, or in some cases you apply through paper, and it's digitized. It goes, depending on which local authority you're in, it goes into one of three systems, iPlan, APAS, or Odyssey. Some of that data is ultimately pulled through into an ePlan website where other members of the public can see that data and can comment on it. Some of it's pulled automatically through into the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and goes into the National Planning Application Database. If you don't get your planning permission, you go off into an appeal system, and you go off into Umbral Planolis, which is the Irish appeal system database. and you go through that system. And if you get planning, you then go off into building control. So when you start to build, you start to upload other types of data. And what we've done is constructed the data dictionaries for each one of these IT systems, and we've looked at how the data flows between them. And there's a lot of data trapped in some of these systems. So in the iPlan system, which is used by 24 of the 31 local authorities in Ireland, that system can collect up to 1,300 different variables through the application process, of approximately which 14 end up in the government open data site. So you can see there's kind of blockages or frictions that stop some of the data flowing out into kind of planning and housing and tracking systems. And then within each one of these boxes, we've also looked at the data flow. So this is the data flow for this yellowy box, the building control management system. And again, we've just tried to look at what's happening with the data, and then what decision is made on that data, where does that data then move to, and so on. And then where some of the data does flow out at the bottom, it flows out into some of these systems like this. So this is a Dublin Housing Observatory. This is an open data site. Anybody can go on to here, and you can kind of query the data. So some of that zoning and planning data has ended up in the Dublin Housing Observatory. Each one of these dots is an interactive. You can click on the dot and it will pull up a little bit of information, and you can click on the web link and it will take you to the planning application files, and so on. And various kinds of data is being pulled in here. So data from different kinds of sources being pulled into the one location. So bit value starts to get pulled out of the data and starts to help inform kind of policy thinking and decision making, and so on. And then in the second part of the project, what we're doing is working with 12 of our organizations from all those ones I showed you earlier on, where we're trying to go into more depth in what they're actually doing. So over a course of 6 months to a year, embedding our researchers into their workplaces, having a look at their data practices, their data infrastructure, their data governance, how they're using and interpreting the data, who they're sharing the data with, and so on. And we've also employed 3 artists for this year and 3 artists for next year to also be part of this kind of telling story. So on the one hand, we're trying to tell stories about the data, and on the other hand, we're trying to tell stories with the data. So stories about data and stories about housing and planning using the data. One set of stories is produced by us as the research team. So it might be through dashboards, might be through our 3D visualization work. Some of it's produced by the artist's own creative practice. So this is a kind of a different register for thinking through what's actually going on here in terms of the data politics or the data power, or how the kind of storytelling kind of happens. And the third one is actually by the stakeholders. So our 12 organizations working with us and working with the artists, producing their own kind of stories as a way of kind of critically reflecting on what they do and how they're doing it, and maybe what they're not doing, what they could be doing differently. So the stories might be around literacy, they might be around storytelling, they might be around interpretation, they might be around governance. It's up to the stakeholders as to what kind of theme that we'll kind of explore with them. And part of the story that we're telling as a research team, I said I'd show you our 3D printed model of the city. So we have this as a virtual model as well, but this is our 3D model. So we have a data projector, and we basically throw the data onto the projection. You can get a sense of the size of this model. It's 3.5 meters by 2 meters. So the person in the bottom is standing in front of the model, and you can see the building use data being cast onto that. And we can project on whatever we want. So we had it working the other day where we had the real-time locations of the buses, so you can see the buses moving along the streets. The top right is kind of aerial photography, and we have a time sequence of aerial photography. The bottom right is it's actually real-time. It's actually pollution. It's pollution levels, which is why it's picking out the road network. So that's it, really. That's a kind of a quick run through of what we're trying to do in terms of getting a sense of all of the kinds of data and what that data could potentially do for us in and the additional uses that could get unlocked out of making that data more available. And I'll end there. Thanks.